Hi there. Let's talk about writing conclusions to your essay. How should you end your essay? Now that you've finished writing your body paragraphs and your argument, you have a really great thesis, let's wrap it up. Here are some things that a conclusion should do. First, it should restate the thesis to underscore what you have already proven. That kind of is your one last chance here to convince your reader that you have convinced them of this argument. It should summarize key takeaways from the argument that were presented above, not remake the whole argument, but just summarize the main points. It should wrap up the essay with final words that provide closure and make the essay feel finished. One tip here is perhaps you could return to the introduction. Maybe you did something in the introduction that you could also do in the conclusion, and that puts a nice, puts bookends on your essay so that it feels complete. And then finally, it should add an expansion point that helps the reader understand why this argument matters, what are its broader implications, so what that you've made this great argument and convinced us with great evidence. Why do I care about this? It's sometimes said that the shape of a history essay conclusion is a triangle. And that's because you're going to start your conclusion by returning to your main point, which was your thesis. But from there, you're going to branch out and get broader and bigger. So the next thing that you might do is summarize the key points of your thesis, but then you're going to end by zooming out to discuss the much broader implications, the larger significance, the so what that follows from what you've proven. These are some things a conclusion should not include. A conclusion should not say, in conclusion, or as shown in this essay. A conclusion should not, at this point, present any entirely new idea or argument that's not related to your thesis. The time for making arguments was above in your body paragraphs. Now is not the time for that. Hopefully your conclusion does not also include the exact same thesis as in your introduction. You're going to want to rework that a little bit using different words and phrases. I mean, keep the same meaning, but please don't just copy and paste from your introduction. And then lastly, a conclusion does not need any evidence. You're not trying to make a new argument here, so you don't need any new evidence. So it may be shorter than your body paragraphs. Let's talk a little bit about this expansion point that you're going to include at the very end, or at least try to include. It's really, it's in some ways the most creative part of your essay. That's why this little guy here is having his mind blown by the creativity in this expansion point. He is enlightened by this new way of thinking about the topic that's provided at the very end. Here are some sentences that you could use to sort of spur your thinking about how to expand from what you've already argued. From these historical examples, we can learn that, or this is a meaningful or significant lesson from history because, or lastly, this can connect to us today because, helps us understand why it matters. So just like your introduction started by zooming way out to take a larger perspective, you might want to do that again here at the end, to zoom out and think about the bigger meaning of this argument that you have presented. This might not be something that's going to come to you in a rush. You might have to spend a few days thinking about this and kind of mulling it over. There's an idea that creativity comes to you in a spark, but to be honest, creativity comes slowly, and it's often after you've really mulled things over and you can't really rush it. So give yourself enough time to be thinking about your conclusion. Okay, I want to show you the rubric on the next slide and have you determine which one of these is describing the criteria for advanced, proficient, or developing. I hope for A, you picked this one. The conclusion returns to the thesis idea creatively and goes beyond restating the main idea to say something interesting about the larger context. Well, first of all, it restates the thesis, but not in the exact same words and in a way that's especially creative. And it does do its job of expanding and saying something interesting about the larger context. Okay, proficient is this one. It does work. It makes the essay feel finished, and it does restate the main idea in slightly different words. And it attempts at an expansion point to go beyond and connect sufficiently to a larger context. Maybe it falls flat a little bit, or it's not particularly interesting, but it does make that attempt. And developing would be here. It leaves the essay feeling not quite finished, unfinished, or it restates the topic in pretty much the same words. And there's really no attempt, or really no effective, earnest attempt to connect to a larger context. Here, let me give you a sample conclusion for a history essay. This essay was about the Roman Republic and what caused it to collapse. The Roman Republic collapsed due to large forces that intensified over the course of a couple centuries, a widening gap between the haves and have-nots, and the repeated failure of attempts to achieve reform through peaceful means. The final straw, however, was Julius Caesar's blatant attempt to seize power for himself and destroy the delicate balance and separation of power that Romans had long held sacred. The ironic thing is that Romans had become a republic in 509 BCE by overthrowing their king, but in the end, they lost their political voices and returned to that same one-man rule. Caesar's nephew, Octavian, became the first official emperor of Rome by following in his uncle's footsteps. So, when American children put their hands on their hearts to pledge allegiance to their republic, they should also use their heads to think critically about the lessons from ancient Rome and understand that the balance that a republic needs to survive. So it restates the thesis argument. If you watched the previous video about how to write an introduction, you would recognize what I'm saying here in yellow mirrors the thesis that I gave in the introduction, but not in the exact same words. It adds an expansion point about so what? Why does this matter? Why is it interesting? Well, it's interesting that the Roman Republic ended up with a king because that's exactly how they started, by trying to get rid of their king. And to be especially creative here, this writer has actually returned to the introduction and is mirroring the way that they introduced this essay. If you watch the video on writing an introduction, you'd see that I started with something about kids saying the Pledge of Allegiance to their republic. And so I end with this last bit here about how you should really think about what you're saying when you pledge allegiance to your republic, because republics, they aren't perhaps natural, and it takes maintenance and care to help them survive. Think about that next time you're saying the Pledge of Allegiance. So that's a wrap. That's how you write a conclusion. Happy writing, and be confident. You've got this.